All right, Entree Architect community, it is 4 p.m. Eastern, which means it's time for the Entree Architect Context and Clarity live conversation for Thursday, April 8th. This is our live and simulcast version. We're also recording this for all of our podcast listeners out there. So hello to you all as you come in from wherever you are. What does simulcast mean, Katharine?
I think that means cast it simultaneously. Can you hear me?
I can.
Okay, good. Because I wasn't sure I was muted there, but yeah, I think that's what it means.
Yeah, we are cast simultaneously to the Entree Architect Community Facebook group, to LinkedIn, to YouTube, and to Twitch. So to all of our thousands and thousands of friends out there on Twitch, hello. Thanks for joining us today. There he is, Kurt from Flint, Michigan, joining us via Twitch. Our number one fan on Twitch. Thank you for joining us. Say hello when you get here. Let us know that you're here and let us know where you're joining the conversation from. Katharine has posted a little link down in the bottom left of your screen right now. If you are on Facebook, because of Facebook rules, we cannot see your name. We don't know who you are. You're simply Facebook user to us because you're in a private Facebook group right now. However, if you give permission by going to chat.restream.io/FB, you can connect your Facebook to Restream and we will see your name. Big Brother will be watching you and will know who you are in this conversation today. So say hi as you get here. Let us know that you're here, even if you're just planning to listen in. Even if you're multitasking right now, I think we're going to change that. I think we're going to draw you into this conversation today because it's going to be a good one. I'm really looking forward to this conversation. I'm really looking forward to the guests that we have in the green room right now. Her requests were not that crazy. We didn't get the, hey, I just want red peanut M&Ms in the green room. So we're in good shape right now. And we will introduce her in just a minute here. So thank you for joining us. Again, say hi. Let us know that you're here and let Katharine know. Say hi, Katharine. Say hi, Katharine.
Me saying hi? Oh, yeah. They're saying hi to me. Sounds
they're saying hi to you. Yep.
Okay. Yeah. I got it now. Got it.
No, we're good. We got Scott out there in Portland. We got Mark in Waxhaw, North Carolina. Greetings from Richmond, Virginia. We have several friends in Richmond, Virginia, don't we? Jody, Louie, they're both in Richmond. I'm not sure which that is. Rod, welcome back from his historic front porch. Tim from Stockton, California. Glad all of you are joining us. There you go. See, they're your fans calling you out there.
That's nice. Katharine. Well, you told them to, but
well, they're listening.
That's okay. It still counts.
So now we know. All right. I know that we've got an important conversation to have here. And you've all been waiting for this all week because we've been prepping you for this. We've been having conversations all week about connectedness. On Monday, we started out by asking a question: what's bigger than our work? How are we connected as a community? If you think about a community of small firm and solo architects, how are you connected? How can you support each other? On Tuesday, we asked, what's bigger than architecture? Thinking about your work, thinking about the impact of your work. What's bigger than what you do? What's your responsibility, maybe beyond your client, beyond the end user, maybe to everyone that encounters your work? And then yesterday, we talked about silos, we talked about bubbles, we talked about what's bigger than ourselves. How do we find other people's perspectives? So we've been prepping all week for this conversation today. So with that, let me introduce you to someone that's in the green room right now. Our guest today is a connector of people, ideas, places, and times. She's a Black woman, an architect, a podcaster, a preservation professional, and a sustainability advocate. Like many of you, she works in the tension between requirements and reality, between history and had to, and she's facilitating freedom by opening up critical conversations about the connectedness that both holds us together and sometimes keeps us apart. Nakita Reed, welcome to Context and Clarity Live. Thank you for joining us today.
Wow, thank you for having me. What an intro, man.
Been working all week on that.
Well done. Well, yeah, it's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thank you for being here. One thing that I didn't mention, Nakita is a podcaster. I mentioned that in the intro, but the name of her podcast is Tangible Remnants. So I encourage everybody to go find Tangible Remnants wherever you consume podcasts and give that a listen. And one of the things that Nakita talks about, probably in episode 1, would be my guess, not remembering exactly where it was, but she talks about her backstory some. So, Nakita, for those of you that are not familiar with that backstory, the first question that I want to start with is, why historic preservation?
Well, mainly because when I was younger, I was always fascinated with dilapidated buildings, and I didn't have the language for it. I didn't know that those were typically historic buildings. So I went to architecture school because I was thinking architecture school is going to teach me all about existing buildings. It did not. And so and so I realized that I needed to learn more about the existing buildings that were already here. And I realized that there's a whole field dedicated to that, and it's historic preservation. And so architecture has always been entwined with preservation for me. So that's why.
I love that. And I did a podcast interview for someone else today. They asked me about my backstory, and part of my growing up. I'm originally from Atlanta, originally from Georgia, and my parents grew up on farms. And so a lot of my early days visiting grandparents, the barns and these other agrarian architecture and sometimes county seats and things like that. And that was beautiful. My dad was transferred to Chicago when I was a kid, and mom is a lifelong learner and explorer. And so I've been to every Frank Lloyd Wright house or, Unity Temple. I used to walk past Unity Temple twice a day when I lived up there. And so that was one of the things that fascinated me, and probably, similar to you, led me to this field. I find it interesting, the tagline, I suppose, for your podcast is the exploration of the interconnectedness of architecture, historic preservation, sustainability, race, and gender. And so we can touch on all of those things today. I know as we've been gathering questions throughout the week that one of the questions is about that link between preservation and sustainability. There's of course this idea that the greenest building or most sustainable building is one that's already here. But there's, I think with everything that we'll talk about, there's a lot of different facets, right, of all of this. So what fascinates you the most about that intersection or that connectedness between preservation and sustainability?
Yeah. So partly it's the fact that sustainability, expanding the definition of sustainability. So we're not just talking about green communities or green technology rather, and we're actually talking about really the triple bottom line of sustainability, which is the environment, the economics, and the equity piece of it. Oftentimes equity gets left out of sustainability. And so there is a couple different pieces of this. So one, there is the NAACP has a group called Centering Equity in the Built Environment. And their tagline is sustainability without equity is sustaining inequity. And so it's really pushing that together to make the case that we need to make sure we're bringing everybody along. And then from a preservation side, we recognize that we're not going to build our way to carbon neutral. We're not going to build our way out of the climate crisis that we're in. And so one of the other groups that I'm in is the Zero Net Carbon Collaboration. And that is basically a bunch of groups that are a bunch of organizations that are together to really get existing and historic buildings into the climate action conversation. So it's members from Architecture 2030, AIA, US ICOMOS, APT, RAIC in Canada. We have some members that are in Ireland. So it's very much a way to make sure we're getting existing and historic buildings into that conversation. And the Climate Heritage Network is also doing some really great work around what's going to be happening at COP26 later this year. Because, as Bill McDonough said, we don't just need to do less bad, we actually need to do good. And part of that is really recognizing the fact that we need to work with the buildings that are already here and make those more sustainable and green retrofits. But how do we do it in a way that's not going to destroy the historic fabric? And it's also not going to impede on future generations from meeting their needs.
Yeah. I heard you talking about this in an interview, and I forget which one, but in a video interview. I think it might have been around your receiving the Emerging Professionals Award from AIDC. But the woman that was interviewing you asked about all the letters after your name, right? And so you went through obviously architect, and AIA was there, NOMA was there, and LEED was there, all the different acronyms.
Mm-hmm.
And so obviously you're involved in a lot of different spaces, and you have this pursuit of finding this interconnectedness of I think most of us look at it and go, okay, well, at least some of those things is really easy to understand how they're connected. Maybe there's a disconnect for some of us in some of those aspects, but how did you get interested in this idea of the interconnectedness, or when did you come to the realization that, hey, wait a minute, there's something to this?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. And it's almost, I think since I knew I wanted to go into architecture, but only because my role has always been both and. Like, for instance, I'm not more Black or more woman. It's both and, you know what I mean? So it just depends on what people see first. And so it's one of those things where I've always kind of had a vision of multiple things are more connected than separate. And so I just kind of always like to connect things. So it's, I'm not quite sure if I can pinpoint an exact time.
Sure.
But I think once I realized that architecture for me was always about existing buildings, and once I started learning more and realizing that that's not the way it is for everyone, I was surprised to find that. I was like, what do you mean? You only want to do new construction? But why? So it's always just kind of been there.
Yeah, that makes sense. I remember the story that you told about, and I forget who you were with, your parents or your grandparents or something, from the story, and you saw an abandoned building, a dilapidated building, and you saw homeless people.
Yeah, like right outside. It makes no sense to me because buildings need people and people need buildings. So even from a very young age, I didn't understand. And this was actually DC at the time. So DC, late 90s, very different place than DC today. But there were a lot of homeless people on the street and a lot of vacant buildings behind them. And I just didn't understand why. I was like, there seems to be a fit there. So that's something that I've also been interested in.
Yeah, that seems to be a fit there. That's kind of a little bit of an understatement. That is, it's a great observation, though. It really is. Hey, how can this possibly be with this separation? Obviously, it whatever it is, it requires some conversations and maybe some uncomfortable conversations.
Mm-hmm.
And even looking at all the letters after your name, right? With some, how does this fit with that? So on and so forth. So how have you learned to navigate these conversations, or start or facilitate, or all of the above, I guess?
Yeah. So I typically, I'm very curious about how things connect together. So whenever I'm talking to an architect who doesn't know what APT is, and that's Association for Preservation Technology, it's like the AIA, but for preservationists. So I'll, talk to them about, okay, well, this is why that exists, and here's what preservation is, and all that. And then I'll meet a preservationist who's like, oh, but we're focusing on mortar or the technology side of it. We're not really concerned about preservation. That's not really or we're not concerned about sustainability. That's not a preservation thing. So then it's like, well, let's talk about that. Let's explore that a little bit more. And then same way when I meet someone who's more so a sustainability professionist, building science person, who's like, well, preservation, that's not built. Like, so wait a minute, like it's just helping people recognize that there are more connections between the different fields. It's something that I've been excited to do. And then layering in 2020 and the cluster that was, and just kind of realizing the vantage point that I had, I realized I could talk more about these things a little bit more publicly. And then also doing more reading and just learning more. And so I started reading The Color of Law last year as well, because as I got more into architecture and realizing that architects actually don't have the economic power that I kind of thought we would have when we were younger. So the people outside of vacant buildings isn't necessarily just an architecture issue. It's more of an economics and development and city planning and policy issue. So learning more about all of the things that got us to where we are now has been frustrating and eye-opening, and getting into more of those frustrating and uncomfortable conversations that have to be had.
And speaking of conversations, and to everybody out there in our studio audience, wherever your studio is, remember, we want your questions and your comments for Nakita. Here in just a second, Katharine will start grabbing some questions and putting them up on the screen to help guide our conversation here. And that's what this is about. It is about having a conversation with Nakita Reed about all of these things. I feel that I don't know if it's a weight, but I feel the idea, right, of facilitating conversations, because if we're honest about it, that's why we're here, right? That's why context and clarity is a thing, is to facilitate conversations. And some of those are uncomfortable conversations and touching conversations and everything like that. So let me ask this. So I was having this conversation earlier today because maybe I'm the elephant in the room, right? I'm a middle-aged white guy, right? And the uncomfortableness for some people, of course. Hey, I'm a middle-aged white guy, and we're going to talk about race today. I'm going to talk with a Black woman about race, or I'm going to talk with two women about gender issues. How do we get past that? How do we start that conversation, or should I? From my point of view, should I start that conversation? I feel like the most important thing for me to do is to sit back and listen, but how do I encourage others to have these conversations?
Yeah. So that is a great question. And so one of the things, so I work at Quinn Evans. And so after George Floyd was murdered, our CEO and our company decided to start a Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Committee called JEDI for that very reason, because it's, for whatever reason, the George Floyd killing opened a wormhole, if you will. More people, particularly in the design profession, started noticing and speaking out more about police brutality, social justice, and really acknowledging design's role in all of this. And it was one of those things where it was an interesting moment for me, because while on one hand I was like, well, welcome to the conversation. On the other hand, I was like, why is this different? Because this isn't new. This has been happening for decades. But one of the things that we did at Quinn Evans is so the first thing that we did as a company was everyone had to read White Fragility, because we needed to set a baseline to be able to have the conversations and even just make the space to have the conversations, recognizing that it is uncomfortable. Everyone's approaching it from different perspectives, different vantage points. And so being able to even just make the space to have the conversation is important. And acknowledging that something is happening is step one. So the fact that you even asked that question, Jeff, is great, because it's there's something happening here. Let's talk about it. And I don't know the answers, and we're going to figure it out together. But being able to start the conversation has been huge. And there are a number of resources. I know people like Brian Lee and also Michael Ford from Hip Hop Architecture. There's a number of also Black architects who are in this space and working with NOMA to be able to have these conversations and help other designers have the conversations. But one of the things that I encourage my white colleagues to not shy away from is the fact that you are affected by race as well. I just feel like a lot of my white friends and colleagues are taught not to talk about race because it's impolite, because they want to say, oh, I don't see color, or I'm colorblind. And that's not the goal. Like, seeing color is not the problem. The problem is treating people differently because of that color, or thinking that there's less than. So it's having the conversation, and even just making space for that conversation is really important.
Yeah, I think it's uncomfortable and maybe even intimidating, I guess, in a way. Assuming.
Yeah, what are you worried about? What's the intimidation, or what's the feeling?
Well, I think part of that, it starts with the assumption that I care, right?
Right.
But the
well, okay, so let's answer that question first. I assume you do. I guess I just assumed you did.
So again, I'm right off of a conversation about this about an hour ago, and it was a great conversation because we really got to the point of talking about the fact that first we have to acknowledge each other as human beings, right?
Precisely.
And personally, I don't think everybody's doing that at this point. So there's that, but I think the intimidation part is, if I do, okay, I care what Nakita thinks. I care how Nakita feels. I don't want to offend Nakita, or whoever is involved in that conversation. So wanting to be supportive, wanting to find a way, and that's really my exploration here, is how can we encourage, and I think I said this a couple of minutes ago, but how can we encourage other middle-aged white guys, right, to get into this conversation? Part of the frustration is that we host a lot of these context and clarity conversations. They're not all about race or gender, of course, but many times when we have these conversations, the people that I judgmentally think should be here are not here, right? They don't show up, but we still need to have these conversations. They have to be here, and in my mind, our role is to facilitate them.
Right. Yeah, and it's one of those things where making the space for the conversations and recognizing the fact that people will come when they're ready, but we just have to keep having the conversations. So it's what's the word? It's exhausting, but also, like, to some extent exhilarating. Like, the fact that I get to talk about white supremacy at a predominantly white architecture firm, and I mean, it's amazing and petrifying and thrilling, and all of those things.
Yeah. Well, I love on your website, if you go, for those of you that are out there, go to NakitaReed.com, so you can see her name up on the screen there. Nakita with an A and a Reed with 2 E's. We actually had this conversation the other day. How many ways can you spell Reed? Well, there's a lot of ways. So if you go to NakitaReed.com and go to the About tab, one of the things that you say is, I'm the Black friend my white friends feel comfortable talking with about race. And
yes,
I think that's got to be the starting point, no matter which side of that coin you're on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's one of those things where it's recognizing that it's not my job to teach anyone about race, because we all have the Google, we all can read books. So it's not doing that emotional labor, but it's more of asking perspectives. And I grew up in a very diverse, I went to a very diverse high school in Northern Virginia, and I didn't actually realize, this is how diverse it was. I didn't realize that Black people were still treated differently until I went to UVA in Charlottesville in early 2002. And I was like, oh, this is still a thing. Oh, okay. So it was just that kind of culture shock, because in my high school, there were like 50 different cultures. I had friends from different parts of the world, spoke different languages. So it was, when I got to UVA, it was almost like I was too white for the Black folks and too Black for the white folks. It was very interesting, it was interesting, but I was like, I'm just going to be me. Because I was never, I've always been more comfortable in very mixed settings as opposed to all one or the other. So I guess more of the connection piece of it.
Yeah. More of the connection and the different, it's not even different perspectives. It's varying perspectives.
Right.
Yeah. That's interesting.
Mm-hmm.
All right. We've got a question.
I have, it's kind of a, for those people asking the questions, we're limited to 120 characters on the screen. So it was a very long question in Facebook. So I'm going to try to summarize it because it's more than just this question. So what Erica was basically saying is that she was wondering if having these at the National Register of Historic Places creates a restrictive environment that is expensive to maintain. And is that then, in that way, is it upholding the traditions of exclusion?
Gotcha. So the National Register of Historic Places, that is pretty much the national repository of historic places. Interestingly, so if a building is listed on the National Register, it can still be torn down. But if it's listed on a local historic register, it typically can't, just because local registers typically have stronger enforcement and all that kind of thing. The caveat, though, when a building is listed on the National Register, then it is eligible for historic tax credits. So there is funding associated with that. The National Register is only about 2% of the register. It focuses on places that aren't focused around straight white males and during the white gaze, basically.
Right.
That is something that many preservationists are thinking about. And one of the issues that often comes up when trying to get something listed on the National Register is this idea of architectural integrity. And the problem with that is that we know, because of urban renewal, because of various policies, a number of areas in cities that were predominantly Black or had other people of color in it were heavily disinvested. So if we're trying to say that the only way that we can get something listed on the National Register is if it still has architectural integrity, but it's in an area that has been disinvested in for the past 30 to 40 years, then that becomes problematic, because then we're keeping a whole slew of buildings out of the register that are actually sites of historic importance and cultural significance. But if we're only saying, oh, it doesn't have architectural integrity, that becomes an issue. And so there's been a lot of conversations about how do we use the National Register nomination process to make sure that we're not still excluding sites and starting to try and address some of the systemic issues that exist within policy, that we know exist in policy, that are just now starting to be more evaluated. And thinking of and continuing that thread on policy, I remember reading The Color of Law, and the part of the book that blew my mind the most was the discussion of Levittown. Mainly because we learn about Levittown so much in architecture school. You know, it's this post-war mass production suburbia. You know, it was the model. The thing that I didn't learn in architecture school was that the only way the FHA would actually finance it was if the developer did not sell to any Negroes, and that had to be codified. So the fact that there were all of these thousands of houses that were, you know, FHA loan approved and all that, but could not be sold to any African Americans, like, wow, that's problematic. And that, you know, chain reaction and learning in more about the FHA and policy and all of those things. So yes, preservation can uphold traditions of exclusion if there aren't preservationists who are paying attention to these things and having these kind of conversations.
Let me flip that one around a little bit too, because Erica was she actually brought this up this morning in our conversation on Clubhouse as well. Mm-hmm. So those of you that are out there that aren't aware of this, Context and Clarity, of course, is this live stream, but we also have a podcast that comes out every morning. And then on Clubhouse, we have our coffee talk every morning where we sort of preview the topic of the day. And so Erica brought this up this morning as well, also from the point of view of, you know, what happens when you have communities, actually like the neighborhood that I live in here in Indianapolis, that the entire neighborhood or here's a piece of the neighborhood, but the neighborhood is listed, which of course has requirements, local requirements and enforcement that may intentionally or not keep. I mean, it may drive gentrification, right? Because if you can't buy, maybe you can buy this property, but you can't keep this property up with the tile roof, the whatever, that's, you know, no, you can't replace that with asphalt shingles. No, it does cost more to keep this up and meet the standards and so on and so forth. So in that, is there a way that preservation enforcement. I don't know if that's the right way to say it, but is there a way that upholds or promotes even? And I'm going to be nice and say unintentionally promotes exclusion, but is that a reality? Is that happening?
Yeah, it is. And it's one of those things where there have been some really great studies done by place economics. So Donovan Rukema and his team, they've been looking at the impacts of preservation on gentrification and what it does to the existing community and what that looks like. So I don't have any good examples offhand, but I would definitely recommend or encourage everyone to check out place economics. But in terms of local preservation commissions, that's also something where volunteering, getting involved, and being involved in those committees makes a difference. There have been a number of preservation commissions that I've gone to where I've had to actually argue preservation law with the Preservation Commission, who's like just some rando who likes preservation and likes old buildings and is trying to tell me that I'm like, listen, I have master's degrees in this, and this is what I'm telling you. Your feelings about this don't matter because this is what the standards say. But it's kind of like recognizing that the politics of who actually gets on those committees matters, how they're appointed, who they are. Sometimes it's just local real estate agents, people who knew the mayor, knew the whatever. So it's making sure that there are people in places that have some knowledge of what actually needs to happen also helps. But it's all politics, networking, who you know, unfortunately. Right.
That's true. So as a follow-up, and I don't know whether you just addressed this really or not, Jeff, in your question. So she follows up with, is it possible that in some applications, preservation is doing more harm than good?
So the answer is yes, but that also could be true for architecture. There are some places where architecture development, basically anything, depending upon the application, could be doing more harm than good. So it's cautious to not, what's the saying? Don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. But it's also making sure that we're just being more intentional and taking a wider lens to make sure we're telling a fuller story. One of the projects that I'm working on now is about women's suffrage and the 19th Amendment. And we're trying to be very intentional about the language because we keep talking about the fact that, the 19th Amendment gave women the right to vote.
Yeah.
And that's kind of what we're talking in school and all that sort of thing. But it's like, actually, the 19th Amendment gave white women the right to vote, not all women.
So and it's like crazy is that I just learned that this year. I just learned so many things in 2020 that I had no idea, even though I consider myself to be pretty well educated. I had no idea.
Right. And so it's all about kind of the way that we're telling the story. And so it's really trying to expand the narrative. So we're including more people in the conversation.
Yeah. I mean, I think that language is really problematic, actually, saying women got the right to vote because that's not true. Just white women got the right to vote.
Right. Exactly.
So, okay. So did we finish that question? Should I move on to another question?
While you're looking for that, one of the things that I have appreciated from your podcast is because storytelling is a big part of what I do and what I'm passionate about. And I found it really interesting to hear you talk in the different episodes of your podcast about the way that the story is told, just like you just did right there with the 19th Amendment. What story are we telling? What are we leaving out? What are we putting in? I think we really, really need to be paying attention to be intentional. Be really intentional about it. And I'm not discounting the fact that stories have been told in a very intentional way for other reasons, for nefarious reasons or not so good reasons. But I really appreciate that perspective that you had or you have in your podcast as well.
Okay, well, we have varied questions here, but I thought this was kind of interesting. Listening to the podcast when you were speaking to the woman who had traveled around the world and had that experience in Africa where she was considered to be born, so that was kind of interesting. Anyway, so that reminded me of this question. Actually has nothing to do with this question, but somehow reminded me of that. What can we learn from how other countries and cultures approach historic preservation?
Yeah. So that is also, these are great questions, man. I'm loving it. So one of the things that got me thinking a little bit differently about preservation was that there are some countries, and particularly some different native cultures, where their idea of preservation is letting an artifact return to the earth. Like, they don't want something to go to the museum. So if it's something that's made out of wood, stone, anything like that, it's their culturally, their way to culturally preserve it is to let it return to the earth. And so that was kind of that turned the idea of preservation for me on its head, because at least in this country, we practice it more so as in, we either need to preserve it as it is because typically some dead old white guy was there, or we need to like adaptively reuse it and then turn it into something else. And so I've always been fascinated with how do we reuse our buildings here. And I did a study abroad in England, actually in Plymouth. And little sidebar, I didn't make the connection until we were there that the Plymouth that we were studying in was actually the Plymouth that like the Pilgrims left from. And I was like, oh, okay, all right. Got it. So anyway, so talking to a conservationist there, because on that side of the pond, they call it conservation. They were like, you guys in America treat your buildings too precious. We have castles older than your country. The buildings were designed. I was like, that is some perspective. You are correct. You do have some buildings older than our country. And so really just thinking about the different ways that we can not have to try and make things a time capsule. Like, the point of preservation is not to make something static and to keep it in stasis. It's more so, how do we make sure that the future generation can reuse this and still learn from the past and take some of that to the future?
That's a really interesting comment. Or not comment, but concept, the letting it return to the earth. And one of the things that went through my head as you were talking about that was, we don't want it to return to the earth and go away and be forgotten, right? We want to somehow preserve that memory, preserve that history, but there's a lot of healing that has to happen in some instances as well. And I wonder, does that help in some way?
Yeah, I think so. And I think part of it also, one of the reasons why also I love preservation is because, and part of the reason why I named the podcast Tangible Remnants is because there have been so many people and cultures that have done things and impacted the built environment of this country. And so I think one of the myths of white supremacy and what we're taught is that only white people have done anything of significance in this country. And it's like, oh, that's not true. Everyone's been here, everyone's been doing things, and we've left remnants, tangible remnants on the built environment that are there for us to remember and to acknowledge and to pay attention to. And so kind of thinking about the healing that preservation can have and kind of teaching and more expanding more of the story. I think that's something that preservation has the power to do. But then again, I'm also a big preservation nerd, so it could be a little biased.
That's all right. That's why we're here, is to get your perspective, and
Right.
all of your nerdiness is
Yes.
on full display.
Well, Michelle points out that textbooks are written by white people and the school boards are white people, and we're white history.
Right.
The fave, I guess, around here.
Yeah, I mean, the victors get to tell the story. So how do we actually expand it so we're changing the narrative a little bit? And I was thinking about this in the context of kind of looking at historic photographs. Whenever we're looking at historic photographs, we're always just seeing the people who are in the photo, but we're never at least I'm typically not thinking about the photographer and who actually took the photo. So I think so much of our history and what we've been focused on is just the people in the photo, as opposed to everyone behind the scenes who was there, who has a story, who has a narrative, who could actually speak about what happened. But we just haven't been focused on them because we've just been looking at the people in the picture, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
That's an interesting perspective as well. I had not thought about that at all.
Okay, I'm going to change gears slightly to sustainability, because we haven't really talked about that yet. So what's the impact? Christian wants to know, what's the impact of building codes on historic preservation when it comes to sustainability?
Yeah, so it has been evolving with the 2015 edition of the ICC, existing in historic buildings let me caveat that again, certified historic buildings. So that means buildings that are either listed on the National Register, on a local register, or a state register. They now have to comply with the energy code if they are doing a alteration level 3 or higher. So if they're touching more than 50% of the footprint of the building, they have to bring it up to code, unless they can get a written letter from the state historic preservation officer or some other preservation official to say that bringing it up to code will negatively impact the historic character of the building. Most won't write that letter. I'm just going to throw that out there. So unless it is a national historic landmark, that is the highest level of preservation protection that you can get in the country. So like the White House is a national historic landmark. So unless it's at that level of significance, then you're typically going to have to bring it up to code unless you are doing less than a 50% alteration. So like the alteration level 1 or level 2, you have to deal with that.
Is that White House up to code, do you think, energy-wise?
I mean, maybe. I feel like particularly with some of the governmental institutions where they don't necessarily have a building code official, it's more like they have their own board. They have a little bit of discretion. So I'm not going to, I don't know. I would hope so. But
well, maybe someone can Google it and put it in the comments. Let us know.
Great.
Well, I think we need the architect of the Capitol as a.
There you go.
Well, we were hoping to get that. Yeah. We'll ask the architect of the Capitol.
Get him after the Pope. Pope's on the wish list.
Good one. Yeah. You have a translator too? Or you speak Italian on the side?
I don't speak much Italian anymore. I did study a little bit of Italian before I went over to Italy for a little while, but
I'm sure we have time. We can brush up on our Italian, Jeff. I'm sure we have a little time.
Yeah, we got some time. I speak macchiato pretty well.
Okay, here's a wide open question. I don't know what the origin was, but here's the question. And again, it was brought down to 120 characters. But he said, if you could do anything you want for the rest of your life, what would cause you to look back at the end and say, this was totally worth it?
Wow, that is a wide open question. All right.
I know. I don't know.
Well,
that's a tough one. It
is a tough one. There's so many options. I think it would probably be helping people connect and helping people see things differently. And I say that because I have a lot of different friends of different cultural backgrounds, different ethnicities. And one of the things that I've realized is that people are just people. So whenever I meet someone who is more prejudiced or more like, oh, us versus them, and just more hatred or filled with more hatred, I'm just like, oh, you need more friends. Because like I feel like if you have more friends of different backgrounds and ethnicities, you would realize that we're more alike than not. I would say if I could just keep connecting people, probably over cocktails, over good food, travel a little bit, that'd be fun.
I wonder what that kind of program would look like. You could bring it to small towns across the country and just make friends with people.
Yeah,
it's true. And just have a bunch of interesting people, and they could say, hey, you're not as scary as I thought.
Exactly.
Like whatever. They don't ever get to. Yeah, well, they're just. I thought about doing that during the. Well, I guess I'm not allowed to talk about that. We're going to go back to the questions.
Now I want to know what you're about to say. I think, and this was in a comment that scrolled by a few minutes ago. It also ties back to something you said earlier. Number one, the idea of meeting people where they are, and I think Christian posted a quote from Frederick Law Olmsted that was talking about forcing people to integrate, or I forget how it said it, when they're not ready to. Because in this conversation that we were having earlier today, it's awfully hard, right, to force people into a perspective that they're not ready for, that they don't want to have. What about? Because yesterday in Context and Clarity, we talked about silos and bubbles and seeing other people's perspectives. Have you found a way in dealing with people that are just against, right? They don't want to see the perspective.
Right.
Have you found a way to bring them alongside, or is it simply you work around the edges with the people that are ready and are open?
Yeah, it's basically work around the edges, because the one of the quotes from Toni Morrison that I keep in mind is that the main function of racism is to keep you distracted from doing your work. So, because you're always having to explain yourself, try and convince people of your worth, trying to prove that you're worthy to exist. And it's like, that's too much time. And we all have a very finite time on this earth. So it's, I say what I can. I, make the cases. I try and have the conversations and be open and create the space for those interactions to happen. But it's not my job to force anyone to have those conversations. And it's one of those things where it's, typically being able to get people to just see things a little bit differently sometimes helps, but it's almost like it has to be an inception situation. It can't, and that's honestly one of the reasons why when Quinn Evans started the Jedi Committee, one of the things that I was telling our leadership was that I was not interested in being on this committee if it was only going to be made up of people of color, because then the perception is that, oh, you're playing the race card, you're race baiting, whatever that means. And so it becomes dismissed if it's not something that we're working on together. So it was making sure that we had people from all different races, because it's one of those things where it's, I've seen this quote floating around Facebook somewhere, but racism isn't a Black problem for white people to feel pity towards. It's, it's a white problem for white people to solve. Like, I can't talk to someone who's racist and get them to not be racist. Like, that's the work of all of the non-racist white people to do. Like that you have more agency than I do to turn someone's heart to not be racist or any of that kind of stuff. So it's just, I don't drag people kicking and screaming. I'm not going to berate people. I'm not going to force the issue. It's, I exist, and then we have the conversation and see where it goes.
Yeah. My favorite part about that comment is, I mean, it really aligns with what we try to do with Context and Clarity and Entree Architect is find a positive way forward.
Right.
And I that makes sense. We're going to, if it's working around the edges, we're going to work around the edges as long as we can keep moving forward, because that's that progress piece is the most important.
Right. Yeah,
Love
absolutely.
Okay. I decided maybe I can say what I was going to say.
Okay.
So I had this idea, and this may be a little strange, but this was my idea. So that there would be a troupe of people who would be going to put on community plays in different areas around. So the people, the traveling people would be all different types of people. They'd be gay people, people from all different religions, and then they'd just be a really fun group of people. So they go put on this community play, but half of the people involved would have to be local people. So then the local people then get to know the travelers, and they get to be friends, and they realize, like, oh, I've never met this type of person before, and you're actually really fun and great. I had a really good time doing this play with you. So then this is the way you would spread this kind of a friendship and goodwill across the land. That's my idea. So if you want to go do that, I would love to do that. You take like a year sabbatical and just go spread love and joy of community plays across. Because when you're doing projects with people and just kind of working alongside them and not like pushing them to think differently, but just letting them get to know, get to know a different way of thinking. I think that's
right. Yeah, exactly. If I'm dealing with someone who they've only seen a Black person on Cops, that's going to be a very different conversation. Or if I'm dealing with someone who's only interacted with a white person through what they see on Jersey Shore, like that.
I never seen that. Should you watch that show?
Just it varies depending on your perspective. And also, I realize as we get older, it is harder to make friends outside of kind of our socioeconomic demographic. Right. Yeah. So it's, that's why I'm grateful for groups like this and other professional groups, and realizing that lots of people can come as they are and then try and connect. And that's also one of the reasons why I'm enjoying more of this. Yep, I'm an architect, and I can't tell you the number of older white architects have been like, but are you licensed? Because you can't call yourself an architect if you're not licensed. Thank you. I'm aware, but I don't think you would have said that to a younger white dude. You would have assumed he was an architect. But because I don't look the way you think an architect looks, you want to, credential check me. But okay.
Yeah, that's really annoying, actually, Nakita. So, Okay. Also kind of on a different topic and all in a way. Should a white person be allowed to translate Amanda Gorman's poetry? He's Christian is a translator. So
Translate into what?
Other languages, I guess.
Oh, I see. I don't know. I mean, I assume I don't know the logistics and how that works. I mean, if it's literally a language translation, then maybe. But I don't know. That's interesting.
Yeah, I wonder if that's a fear of losing nuance,
Okay,
or something. Maybe that's the first thing that pops into my head, but I'm not quite sure.
I just thought it was interesting. We were often talking about taking issues that are outside of the architectural realm. So, I mean, just thought I'd include that as a question.
Interesting.
Yeah. Okay, let's see. What else?
So while you're looking for the next one, I'm going to read Merritt's because it's right at the top of the screen. It says, Katharine, what you are describing is almost like participatory theater a la Augusto Boal, the activist.
I'll have to look that up.
I know. I'll have to look that up too.
And Merritt, I apologize because I'm sure I butchered that name. So,
well, that's pretty cool. I mean, honestly, I really would like to do it. So anybody who hears this later in the future, just send me an email.
Forming her band of.
Because at the end, everybody just hugs each other and they stay in touch, and it would be like a 2 or 3 month situation in each place. I don't know. I think it could be. I think it could work to spread that. All right. So we also have this question about that Leslie had. Well, she wants to know, where did all the preservation pragmatists go? So I'm going to put that up on the screen, but she calls preservation pragmatists are the architects and planners who saw historic preservation as a means to celebrate both architecture and community of reviving life and soul.
Yeah, that's a good question. I feel like and preservation as the field has been evolving. But I guess it depends on the city, depends on the locale. Because there are some locales that are hyper focused on keeping things exactly as they were. They don't want solar panels, regardless of how good the Tesla solar panels look like tile. But there has to be the reality of the economics of maintaining a historic building and then the preservation protections that go into it. So making sure that we're not pricing people out and not gentrifying the area is something we have to also be mindful of. And also just realizing the fact that as buildings get older and as buildings and people get older, we need to make sure that they're able to still age in place. And what does that look like? How do we update them? So much real concerns.
Yeah.
I like that idea of buildings aging in place.
Right, exactly.
Yeah. I'm stuck on your returning to earth comment. Yeah, I'll be mulling over that for a while.
Yeah, and it's one of those things where, as I've been learning more and learning more about work with Indigenous communities, and still learning how to do land acknowledgements, and really just kind of reevaluating things that I've been taught, and even just kind of the idea of manifest destiny. The way that I was taught that made it sound so beautiful. Like it was just this natural trees, and not thinking of like the displacement, destruction, the murder, all of the bad stuff that went along with manifest destiny. And so just thinking like, oh, how do we tell that story? How do we, get to that layer as well? So we're also talking about Indigenous cultures and honoring those, and how preservation changes from culture to culture. And so just in the States, we have state historic preservation offices or SHPOs, but then we also have TIPOs, which are tribal preservation officers. So there are TIPOs and SHPOs in the country.
That's interesting. I know we're coming up close to the top of the hour here.
Well,
so
that's what I was just about to say, Jeff. I was about to say we only have 5 minutes left.
Yep.
Sorry to step on you there.
I know, it's my one thing.
So why don't we, do you have one last good question?
While
you're looking for it again, sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead. I have to put it up on the screen.
Okay. A reminder, we're talking with Nakita Reed right now. Nakita's an architect. She's a preservationist. She's a podcaster. She's a sustainability advocate. She's a lot of things. So I encourage you to look for her podcast, Tangible Remnants, and go to nakitareed.com to learn. You can find the podcast there as well, but you can find out more about Nakita at nakitareed.com. Tomorrow, the past 6 or 7 Fridays, we've taken a little side trip to entertain a mini series on digital and social media platforms that architects could use. We're not going to do that tomorrow. Sorry, Katharine. All week we've been asking questions. What's bigger than? What's bigger than your work? What's bigger than architecture? What's bigger than ourselves? Of course, this conversation today is really what's bigger than. What's, talking about connectedness. So I want to flip that around tomorrow and see if we can make this actionable and ask the question, what's the least that you could do? So if you learned anything this week, if anything resonated with you this week, tomorrow's conversation is about taking action and finding something that you can do to make progress. We'll get back to digital and social next Friday, but tomorrow we'll do that. And then also to give you a little preview, a little heads up, next week, on Thursday, this version, this Context and Clarity Live version, our special guest will be Randy Wilburn, whose new-ish organization, new-ish firm is Encourage, Build, Grow. You may recognize Randy's name from any number of podcasts. He actually, in his bio, it says he's a serial podcaster. I think he has at least 3 going right now that I can think of. But Randy was a longtime co-owner of Zweig Group, or is Zweig White back then. It's Zweig Group today. That's hard to say. Zweig.
Zweig Group. That is hard.
You might be familiar with them from A&E management, consulting, publishing. They're a really good organization in the A&E world. But Randy is one of the original co-owners over there, and now he's out on his own doing Encourage, Build, Grow. So he will be our guest on next Thursday.
Cool.
What do you got, Katharine?
Okay, well, now we only have 2 minutes, so I don't know if we have time for this one, but how do you stop? This is also the shortened version. Okay, so how do you stop gentrification that's often triggered by the cachet of National Register? I guess that NR's National Register district status.
So I would encourage you to take a look at some more place economic stuff, because there have been studies on that. Sometimes there has been a false equivalency between historic districts and gentrification. But I think the thing to keep in mind is that the people who currently live in the neighborhood, they also want improved amenities, and they want the neighborhood to improve. So it's more so how do you gentrify the area without displacement? Because it's the displacement piece is the problem, not the improvement of the built amenities.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I had not thought about it like that before. That's a good way to put it. Mm-hmm. Thank you for that question, Leslie. And to everybody else that's out there, thank you for all of your questions and comments. We are trying week by week to get you more and more involved in these conversations, because we have this technology, we have this ability to connect like this. It's fantastic. I would love to just have a conversation between myself and Nakita and Katharine, but we really do want to pull all of you into and engage all of you in these conversations. So thank you for being a part of these conversations with us. And if you ever have any suggestions, guests that you'd like to see or hear from in the future, topics, things like that, please reach out to us. I'm not hard to find on social. It's always Jeff_Echols. You know where I am. If you're part of the Entre Architect community, you know where I am on Facebook. Send me a message. Send Katharine a message. Katharine, is it okay if they send you a message?
Yes. Send me a message.
Okay. But let us know. Give us your feedback and let us know what you want to hear and what topics you want and things like that. Nakita, thank you for coming on here and having this conversation with us today.
No problem. Thanks for inviting me. It's been fun.
Yeah, absolutely. I've enjoyed this. I appreciate you. I appreciate you, Katharine, for keeping the ship upright and going.
I don't know. I
pretty
think I
much-
rock it. I think I rock the ship more than keep it upright, honestly. But
I said
it's my pleasure to be here. It was
you
fun. I
can
would love
rock
to go
it.
on. I would love
Yeah.
to go on for another hour talking about this.
You can rock it, but it's staying upright. So
Yeah.
that's the good thing.
Yeah.
So with that, again, thank you to all of you. We appreciate every single one of you. Thanks for being here. I say this all the time, but thank you for making context and clarity a thing, because it allows us to facilitate conversations like this. And without all of you building this community around us, we couldn't have these conversations. And I think it's important to have them. So again, thanks to everybody in their own studio audience. Thanks, Nakita. Thanks, Katharine. I will be back tomorrow, 4 p.m. Eastern, same bat time, same bat channel. And we will talk about taking action tomorrow. What's the smallest thing? What's the least that you can do? That'll be the topic for tomorrow. As usual, I'll post an announcement of that as early as I can tomorrow morning, and we'll do that again. If you want to join the pre-party at 9 a.m. Eastern on Clubhouse, we'll be there inside the Context and Clarity room on that same topic tomorrow at 9 a.m. Eastern. The Context and Clarity podcast comes out at 12:01 Eastern every weekday morning. Short form, you can listen to it faster than you can drink your coffee. So if you want to check that out, it's wherever podcasts are consumed. And with that, everybody, thank you. Take care of yourselves. Stay well, stay safe, keep everybody around you safe and well. Take a little bit of time to breathe tonight. Get a little bit rejuvenated and ready to go back at this tomorrow. And I'll see you tomorrow, everybody. Thank you. Have a good evening.